Okay, hello and welcome to Orientation 101 for all the electrical equipment on the back side of the altar. Now most people of course don't sit on this side, so you don't see the big nest of wires back here, but we're going to go through what each one does. First off, there's several components back here behind the altar. This box here, which will actually be soon replaced with another large-ish looking box, is the subwoofer. We have the crossover system, which splits the sound to the two amplifiers, and the amplifiers themselves are under the altar. Now the way this system works is it's fed from our board upstairs that we're going to look at in a little bit here. It's fed with two channels of sound, the left and the right, which is coming out of this subfloor point. So if you want to get a peek inside the panel here, you'll notice that there are 4 points in here. Two of them, number 3 and number 4, are your left and your right input from the mixer board upstairs. Those left and right points come into the crossover.
Recording or not?
Yes, the red.
Okay. There, just recorded that, John. Yeah. Anyway, the left and the right, which again back here is number 3 and number 4, are fed into the crossover. We'll get to number 1 and 2 in a minute. On this crossover unit, it takes your two channels of input, which are labeled input on the back side here, input 1 and input 2, and it splits it.
Point at that again.
Input. Input right on the back side here.
Okay.
Input 1, input 2. And it splits that signal into two signals, a high and a low. We're using what's called a bi-amplified system, where you have a separate amplifier for the high sounds and the low sounds, the treble and the bass. And this is what splits it into two. Not really much modification is going to be needed back here, but we're just going this over so you know how it's hooked up. So we go into the two inputs here, and it comes out with 4 outputs, 2 high outputs and 2 low outputs, plus a separate output for the subwoofer. It's all labeled as such: high left right, low left right, and then subwoofer, which goes directly into this piece. The amplifiers over here in our system, the top amplifier here, the Alesis RA100, is the amplifier for the tweeters, or the high sound, and it has separate gain controls for the left and right tweeters. Again, you shouldn't have to modify this. The Ramza amplifier on the bottom, which does not have any gain control and cannot be adjusted volume-wise, is the amplifier for the mid and mid bass, which are the larger speakers on the speaker elements that are up above to the left and right of the sanctuary. So we have our treble amplifier and our bass amplifier and our subwoofer, all fed from the crossover, fed from the two left and right channels coming out of the box. Now, a lot of the time when we're up here, we're going to need some microphones for like kids programs, Sunday school programs and whatnot. And that's where our other jacks come into play down here, our jack number 1 and jack number 2. Those are microphone inputs that you can plug a mic into, as actually one is right now in number 1. And you can get that input up into the board upstairs to have the microphones up in the front of the sanctuary. So in order to do that, all you do is just plug the microphone into 1 or 2 or both, and then place the microphone wherever you want them up near the front of the church. If you wish to turn this system off, there are 4 power switches to turn it off. If it's not going to be used for, say, a couple weeks, or for some reason we need to turn it off, the power switches are as follows. There's an amplifier power switch here. There's an amplifier power switch here. Then on the front side of the crossover, there's a power switch on the front right of that, right here. Okay? And then on the back of the subwoofer, I'll go again, this will change. There is a power switch right here.
Let me see your hand. There you go.
Right there. Now, of course, if all else fails, you can just unplug it. I would strongly not recommend that you unplug it without powering off first, as it can cause a surge through the system that could damage the equipment. So if you must unplug, turn off first unless it's an emergency. So, that's it for the hardware up here, guys.
We're ready, Larry.
Okay, now we're upstairs here where the mixing board, equalizer, and all this stuff is generated and goes down to the outputs that we just described down there. So, now here we have our components. We have our Yamaha mixing board. We have an Alesis equalizer, which is currently not tuned and bypassed, but I might be endeavors and fix that up sometime, or you might. This little piece up here is the wireless receiver for Pastor's microphone. When Pastor is speaking and there's signal coming through it, you'll notice that this lamp right here blinks, indicating that there's a signal coming through it. So, for example, if you hear Pastor talking and you don't see this blinking, that means he hasn't turned it on at his end, because he can disable and mute it down there. So you can make the universal gesture of turn your mic on, which is this.
How does
Okay.
that gesture go
Oh,
again?
yes, the turn your mic on, that's this.
Okay.
And he usually picks up on that pretty quick. All right, so now as you'll recall, down in the bottom behind the altar, there were two inputs coming in there. Remember number 3 and number 4 on the panel? Well, those come out of the wall right behind us here in the corner, which you may or may not be able to see very well.
I can.
And comes up under the board, and that actually is tied to the output of this equalizer, which is tied to the output of this mixing board, which is where all the other stuff comes in. So we just did it kind of in reverse order. Now our new computer system here is going to generate the sound. It'll go into the equalizer board. Also, the pastor's mic comes in here. Also, there's a separate input for like an extra CD player or whatnot. And then finally, the 2 microphones that you've had down at the bottom you can plug in optionally, those are also controlled through here. So let's walk through what all these little buttons on this board do. First of all, at all times when you're operating this board, make sure your 2 red knobs, these are your master volumes, and has nothing to do with the downstairs nursery, by the way. Your 2 master volumes need to be up all the time. If these get down, you're going to be lopsided, sound funny, or whatnot. We're going to control our volume with all these sliders right here. Now, the way this is wired up is number 1 and number 2 here. These correspond with the microphones on the number 1 and number 2 box downstairs. So, for example, if you have the left-hand side of the sanctuary with that portable mic number 1, the right-hand side with that portable mic number 2, like we would for our Christmas Eve service, you can control those here. There's taped off lines on all the microphone inputs, by the way, that don't allow you to turn them up more to cause feedback, like you just heard in the background, since that mic's still plugged in. So 1 and 2 are those optional mics plugged in the box downstairs. Number 3 here is the pastor's wireless microphone, which is received through this little box like we talked about. And again, during a service, typically, you put it up to the edge of the tape. Depending on how pastor places the microphone on his lapel, sometimes he places it a little closer than other times to his mouth, so you might have to attenuate the volume slightly, especially if he is speaking really loudly, gets really enthusiastic, or says the letter P or T a lot. So, pastor on number 3 here. All right. The next few pads down here are some auxiliary inputs. They're typically not used. In fact, number 4 isn't even wired to anything right now. Number 5 and number 6 are wired to an auxiliary input line. These little cords right here. So if you want to plug in a CD player or cassette deck or something extra, number 5 and number 6 map to this plug that's just kind of sitting here. Now, the most important ones on here, aside from the pastor's mic, are your number 7 and number 8. This is what's tied into the output of the computer system, which generates the hymns. Now, when we're playing our hymns, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit, we want to ensure we adjust our volume so we only have to turn these up to about 15 or so. If we have to push them much farther, you're going to get a lot of noise, you're going to get overdriven noise, and so forth. So we're going to learn how to attenuate the output of the computer to match about, right in here range. Now keep in mind, when you're moving this slider here and this slider here, you notice I'm doing it in pairs. That's because these are stereo inputs, unlike the microphones, which are mono inputs and only have one channel. We need to move these together at all times when you're using this input. Otherwise, the sound may sound lopsided and distract the congregation. So, on this input, always stick together. Now, we have a whole bunch of other controls up on the top here that you can choose to work with if you wish. Now, first off, we'll talk about these with relation to our pastor's input. Up top here, we have our first one is our gain control. This is the master gain of the input of his microphone. So, for example, if all the time he's too loud or all the time he's too soft, that's when we would mess with this gain control. It's currently set to the optimum place for the current microphone, so I wouldn't really mess with that. Now, the next 4 buttons here, the green ones that you're seeing, adjust the tone of the sound coming through the channel. The top one is your high treble. The second one adjusts the frequency at which the third one affects the sound. So, for example, if the center of his voice on certain days a little lower than other days, you can adjust this to match the centering of his voice, and then this to adjust the mid-tone of pastor's voice. Usually it's right around as it's set now. And then this last green knob is the low frequency sound, which is usually for voice turned way down. Since the microphone's really sensitive at the close range that it's put on his lapel, or whatever the appropriate term for that green thing and he wears is. I'll have to get on that later. Edit here point. The low frequency is usually turned down, otherwise he'd be really, really boomy. So you want to pay attention to that one as well. Now these gray points here are auxiliary outputs. Now we don't really need to worry about any of those except for auxiliary 1. This is tied to the output that goes to the computer to record Pastor's audio. And again, it's set right here. You shouldn't really have to mess with it. There is another related setting to this that we'll talk about in a minute that you may have to adjust. So that's the line on Pastor's mic there. And finally, at the bottom here of these pins is the pan. Since this is a one-channel mono input on here, this will adjust which side it comes out downstairs. Now, Pastor usually stands slightly to the right side of the congregation. So that's why you'll see this setting is slightly to the left, because the sound coming literally out of Pastor's mouth will slightly offset the left-handedness of the projection through the stereo sound system downstairs. Okay, so that's a quick run through of what's on here. Now, of course, on every single channel, all of these buttons have the same effect, but we use them in different ways. On our music input here, which is 2 channels, a left and a right, you'll notice the pan on one is all the way to the left and the pan on the other one's all the way to the right, because it's a 2-channel input, and and it goes through 2 separate banks in here. Again, we have the same settings up and down. The gain, which you'll notice is very low. When we have a direct interface line input, such as this computer system, it will usually have a low gain because its input will be pretty much matched to what the board expects. So don't mess with that. Small movements on these particular pieces can have a dramatic and possibly detrimental effect on the sound. Now the rest of them, same thing, the frequency range. You want to move these similarly to each other as much as possible. Now here's a quick hint. Up on the front, your left-hand channel and your right-hand channel have a slightly different sound. Remember when I said that I haven't had time to properly set the EQ? Well, that's why. Since those were custom-made speakers, their tonality is slightly different. You'll notice that the one on the left-hand side has a little bit less bass capability than the one on the right-hand side. So you eventually end up turning the bass up slightly on that side. So that's something that's a little more advanced once you get used to how the sound is during the service. But another thing is depending on the type of content, you may wish to set these differently. If your content is coming from a MIDI file generated on the computer by itself, then it'll generally have more bass than it would if you're playing a pre-recorded organ piece, like one from our organ discs that we'll see later. So you will be adjusting these on the fly, although most of the time, as you see here, it'll have a slight kick on the treble. This is a little bit higher than normal on the mid, so mid will usually be right about center, and the bass during a wave or a pre-recorded sound will usually be a little bit higher. On a MIDI file, it'll usually be a little bit lower. The auxiliary controls have no effect on this bank because they're currently not hooked up to anything. So that's the coverage of all these guys down here. Now, there is one additional setting that's very important when we're recording the audio from Pastor's microphone. You'll remember that we had our auxiliary 1 here is set up a little bit because that's where we're pushing the sound of the computer. This auxiliary 1 here is linked to our auxiliary send 1 here. Now this setting of this particular control is exceedingly sensitive and exceedingly important to get good quality sound on the computer audio recording. What you will want to do in the program is you will adjust this knob until you have no floor noise when there's no sound coming from the mic. In other words, when Pastor's not talking, you need to adjust this so there's no hiss or pops or anything in the background. It's not all the way at the bottom, it's not all the way up. It's somewhere in the middle where that lowest noise point is. And we'll show you on the computer how to do that in a little bit. Finally, the last thing on this board that is an option to use is this neat little button here called the Q or phones. This is linked to this headphone output here. I have in the past used that for a second set of speakers that's located up here in the loft to provide a surround effect for certain parts of the service, for example the chimes. This here, it controls the output to the headphones. And the output to the headphones is specifically for the computer music. You notice these 2 buttons called Q here. When these are depressed, there's like push buttons, you depress. Whatever's depressed on here will go through this knob to this output. And you notice that these here, the regular computer music, are the only outputs that are mapped through there. If I were to hit this button down here to kick on the Q for Pastor's mic, that means the Pastor's sound would come through the speakers up here. But we don't usually do that. So this here, the Q phones controls what comes out of this headphone jack. This is also useful if, for example, you're coming up on a song and you're like, oh wait, did I forget to put something in there, or maybe I need to preview and check this music. What you can do is you could unplug the upstairs speakers, grab your set of headphones right here,
Right.
and plug it into this input. And still with this all the way down, so there's no sound going to the congregation, you can play something and then turn this up slightly and it'll come through your headphones and nobody else will hear it. So that's a nice way you can preview an audio program that you're a little bit unsure of before you play it for the congregation.
Go.
Okay, now we're going to talk about how we actually will create a hymn in our computer system for playback during the service, or for that matter, any liturgical elements, incidental songs, offering, postlude, and prelude, and so forth. I'll be referencing the outline noted on the How to Make Hymns document that you can get separately in Word format. Alright, so first we're going to talk about how we get our hymns. There are 3 pieces of software that are installed on this computer and that you can install on your own in order to create and play our hymns. Those pieces of software are called Noteworthy Composer. It's a note editing program. You can see the link on the bottom of the desktop. It looks like a little keyboard, or there's a bigger one right up here. Noteworthy Composer. That's our music notation and sequencing program. Our second piece of software we're going to use is called Goldwave. Some of the hymns that we have been pre-recorded. We had a really nice set of discs that were purchased from Northwestern Publishing House. It has about 108 hymns pre-recorded, and of those hymns, many are of tunes that are used in multiple hymns throughout our hymnal. The Goldwave program is noted on the desktop with a little microphone / CD symbol, and that's what we're going to use to edit those pre-recorded hymns. For example, if they need extra or less verses or other things. Then thirdly, the last piece of software we're going to use is called XG Synthesizer. It's a piece of software by Yamaha that actually creates musical sounds for different instruments and does a rather good job of it. That you have to get to in kind of a weird way. It's down in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen in the system tray. You just double-click on the system tray icon and that program will come up for us. So first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss what we do once we know what hymns we're going to have for a Sunday and what songs. Now, Pastor will provide you with a list of the songs and list of the hymns, as well as the service folder. So you want to print that out in advance so you have it ready to go. You're also going to want to have a hymnal with you, and preferably an internet connection. Unfortunately, we don't have that today, so we won't be covering that portion of the demonstration. But let's take a look at our upcoming Sunday service. It looks like our first hymn for Transfiguration Sunday is going to be hymn 250. So we're going to look up hymn 250 in our hymnal here and find out what it is for starters, since I haven't memorized the hymnal. It looks like this one is From All That Dwell Below the Skies. Now, of course, we want to do this as efficiently as possible, and many hymns, or tunes for many hymns, are already in the system. So we're going to go ahead and search the hymn database that's already on this computer and see if we've done this hymn before, which I'm pretty sure we have. So what we're going to do, we're going to go into our Start menu, go up to our My Documents area, and right-click on My Music, and select Search. Once the search folder comes up, we're going to search in a couple different ways for this hymn. First, we're going to search by the hymn number, hymn 250. There's a certain format that all the hymns are stored with file names on our system here. And the way it is, it's the format of the hymn number, then a dash, then the title of the hymn, and then the number of verses at the end of the file name for that hymn. So we're going to type in 250 and see what results from that. And lo and behold, if we look at the top of the screen here, we notice that we already have hymn 250, From All That Dwell Below the Skies. It's already in our database, so we won't have to create that again. You'll notice it's in a previous service. We have services all the way back to 2004 saved on this computer, so likelihood of finding something already being done is quite high. So what we're going to do is, now that we've located this, we're going to check out that it's okay in a minute. But first, let's figure out what we're going to do in case we don't find it as quickly and easily as this. Okay, let's pretend we're going to go to our next hymn. There's another hymn on here, hymn 122. We're going to see if we can find that one in the same method. So we've already done a search. We're going to click the change file name or keyword, or you can just start a fresh search through the start menu like we did a minute ago. We're going to search for 122. We always search for the number first. It searches. We don't find anything. Now, don't give up right away. We also want to search using the name of the hymn. So we're going to look up hymn 122 and get the name of that particular hymn, which is Sing My Tongue the Glorious Battle. So, you don't have to type all the different words of the hymn to try to search for it. Just pick a few keywords, because this is a fuzzy logic search and it'll kind of put it together. So we have Sing My Tongue, the Glorious Battle. We can look for the word tongue and glorious in the same line, because that probably isn't going to show up too often together. Tongue and glorious. We searched for that. Oh, well, we didn't find anything that time either. Okay, now wait, we don't give up hope yet. We still have the opportunity to find the hymn without actually creating it. So if we look in our hymnal here, see that very well. In the bottom right-hand corner of the hymn page, it says what the tune is. And you notice in this one, it's Fortunatus Nu. Now, I'm probably thoroughly mispronouncing that, and a lot of it's in German. Like, look at this next one. Verdenken dir Jesu Christ. Yeah, we don't know how to say it, but that doesn't matter. We're going to look at this hymn name, or the tune name, pardon me, this is the name of the tune, not the hymn. Fortunatus Nu, and we have a nice little index all the way in the back of the hymnal on page 945. We're going to find our tune index. And this lists all the tunes that are used in the hymnal and which hymns use that tune. So maybe another hymn will use the same tune, and we can find that. So let's look down here. Here's our Fortunatus Nu, and oh man, it looks like hymn 122 is the only hymn that uses that tune. Okay? So now we're really stuck. We looked for a number, we didn't find it. We looked for the name, we didn't find it. We looked for the tune to see if any other hymns have that particular song. Should we have, by the way, found that tune with another hymn? Let's say it was the same tune as hymn 400. We do the same thing. Search for 400, search for the title of that, and go through. Some hymns have, or some tunes have about 6 or 7 different hymns that use that same tune. But we didn't find that on any of these. So now we're actually going to have to make the hymn from scratch. Now this is where it comes into play to use our Noteworthy Composer notation software. You remember it was that little link that looks like a piano on the desktop. So here's how we do if we need to create a hymn from scratch. First off, we load our Noteworthy Composer program. We're going to create a new document. We can go to File, New, if I can aim correctly. We want to use the blank score and hit OK. This next thing, you can choose to put in some information if you wish, but that's really not important right now. When we save it, we'll do a different title and everything. So we'll just click OK to go past that. Now you notice we have an open editing window. What we're going to want to do is set up the basic elements of a hymn, and it's going to be the same no matter what hymn you are doing. The first thing we want to do is create 4 staves, or however one wishes to pronounce it. You just click the plus button up here for new staff. You can also hit Control A if you prefer. And now we have created 4 staffs on the notation sheet here. Now we want to set those up to match our hymn. We'll take a look in our hymnal here and notice that our key signature has 3 flats. Don't worry about the time signature, that's not important to what we're doing here. But we're going to set up our key signature and our clefs. We're always going to have the top 2 lines treble clef. There's a little treble clef button in the top left of the screen. So we'll click 2 treble clefs, and we'll click 2 bass clefs. We'll find out why we're doing that in a second. Now we want to put the same key signature on all of them. In this case, 3 flats, which we'll be reminded quickly which key signature that is, and I'm not remembering off the top of the head. So 3 flats will be E flat major key. Is it? Nope. Oh, I made a mistake. Let's try that again. B flat major key. 1, 2, 3. Nope. I would think I was right the first time. Yes, E flat major. You'll notice on the screen it has 1, 2, 3 flats noted there. So we can go ahead and click that in, and lo and behold, look, there's 3 flats. Now, if you don't want to go through the whole menu again, as with any part of this program, just like a word editing program, you can highlight something, copy it with Control-C, paste it onto the next staff. And we're going to do the same thing, so all 4 staffs have the exact same key signature. Okay? Now we've got our key signature, our clefs, and our staffs set up. The next thing we're going to want to do is a little bit of a maintenance to the staff to make sure it's going to sound okay. We're going to insert on staffs 2, 3, and 4 a notation for a performance style. Now, if you're familiar with music, you've probably heard the term tenuto before, but this is just going to make the software we're going to use later to play it back smoothly. And that's how an organ is supposed to sound. So we select staffs 2, 3, and 4 only. We're one at a time. Hit P to bring up the performance style and select tenuto and place that there. You notice a little tenuto pops up. You can navigate staffs by the page up and page down on here. There's a lot of keyboard shortcuts. Almost every single function in this program is a keyboard shortcut, and you can reference those in the training manual provided separately. So we're going to go to 2, 3, here's number 3, we put tenuto, and number 4, we put tenuto. Okay? Now we're ready to start putting in our music notes. Now what we're going to do is we want to start with our melody line on the top first staff. Staff 1 is just for the melody. And in your hymnal, you can just follow it right along, entering the notes. There are some keyboard shortcuts that will be very helpful for doing so. For example, you can change the note duration with the numbers 1 through 5, 1 being a whole note, 2 being a half note, 3 being a quarter note, 4 an eighth note, etc., etc. And then you can use the arrow keys to move the location on the staff up and down where the note's going to be placed. For example, the first note of this song is a quarter note C. So a quarter note is number 3, and we go down to the C position and hit enter. And there, lo and behold, a quarter note showed up on there. And we can continue to put in the rest of the melody line all the way till the end. There are a few other notation things you can reference the manual. I won't go over here. For example, how to put in a tie with a slash since it's tied over the measure and so forth. So we're going to go ahead and enter the entire melody line of this hymn. Once we complete our melody line, we want to go ahead and take the whole melody line, which of course will be a lot longer than we have here. We'll highlight it, and we're going to copy it with Control-C down to our second staff. So highlight, Control-C for copy, go to the second staff, hit Control-V as in Victor to paste it on there. Now you notice that both of these are the same. Okay? On staff number 2, we're going to add the accompaniment for the treble line, the alto line on our hymn here today. So the way we'll do that is in the same method we use to enter the melody or any other notation. You go, except for you're going to want to put it in a chord. So you notice we already have our C note here, and on our hymn we have a note below it that's going to be in a chord. So we want to go to the right position, and you hold down Control and hit enter, and you notice it creates a chord with that. So when you hit Control and enter instead of just enter, it'll place the note in a chord with the note immediately before your cursor. So now we can go through and we can add all of the rest of our accompaniment line. If, in this case, this last note of the first measure here is actually the same on both the melody line and the alto line, do not re-enter it. If you double enter a note, it will let you do it, but it'll come out obnoxiously loud when you play it back. So if the same note appears on more than one voice, of either the melody line or the soprano, if you were, the alto, the tenor, the bass, if there's the same note in the same octave, don't double it up. If you accidentally do that, like I just did here, you can Control backspace, which will delete the second note out of it as well. It'll also obviously take off the tie that we just had. So we've copied our melody line to our second line, and we've added the alto line to that. Now we're going to use kind of the same method to enter the bass and the tenor, except for in reverse order. We want to do the bass first on staff number 4. So in this case, we'll go ahead and put that in real quick. Okay, here's just the first measure of our bass line plus, okay, just to be equal, we'll put in the next note of the next line there. I missed, interestingly enough, if you miss something, you can just go ahead and insert, just like a Word document where you type in the middle. I missed one note there a minute ago, and well, there it is now. So now we have the first measure and a note of the bass line. We're going to do the same thing. Once we put that in, we're going to highlight it, we're going to copy it, Control-C, we're going to paste it, Control-V, onto the tenor line, and we're going to add the tenor notes. We're just cutting and pasting because we need to have the melody line and our pedal line, also the bass line, separated for how we're going to voice it or assign instruments to this to make it sound good. So we've copied our bass line up to our staff 3, and we're going to add the tenor voice to it now. Again, remember to hit Control and then the note in question, and it'll add it to a chord. Okay, and one more. What note is that? Okay, so now you'll notice we're done entering the music for this particular measure plus 1 count. And we have our staff 1 in melody, staff 2 is our melody plus alto, staff 3 is our tenor and bass, and staff 4 is only our bass. Now, before we start assigning instruments to this, we want to make sure it sounds right. So we're going to go ahead and play this. You can play it by either clicking the play button, or I like to use the keyboard shortcuts a lot, F5. Okay, now it's only a measure, and you notice it's in a piano voice. That's the default voice, and that's the easiest one for you to listen and see if you made any mistakes or chords just don't sound right or whatnot. We're not going to convert over to an organ and pedal voice until we're sure that we've got all our notes correct. The other thing you'll notice when you're playing it is it went really fast. Before we did not designate a tempo, because on the hymn page they don't designate a tempo ahead of time. We're going to have to figure out how fast to make this hymn, and the best way to do that is to sing the hymn along with your music you've just created. So I've only done a measure on here, so it might sound kind of funny, but sing my tongue the glory. Okay, that's about it. That's pretty fast. There's a lot of people in our congregation that probably wouldn't keep up with that, even though it could be sung that fast. So what we're going to do is we're going to designate our tempo. Now you only have to designate the tempo on one staff, and it'll affect all the other staffs. And you want to make sure to put it at the beginning, right after your key signature. So we're going to go up to staff 1. We're going to hit T for tempo, and it brings up the tempo dialog. The default tempo, which it just played at, is 120, which is obviously a bit fast. So we're going to go over here, we're going to change that maybe to about 100. You just hit enter. You notice it has a little tempo mark that appears on here. Let's take a listen to it again. And you can listen to it and say, okay, well maybe that's still too fast. If you need to modify it, just delete it, tempo, and we'll put maybe 80 in there, okay?
Hold.
Our tempo to match the appropriate tempo for the hymn so it's singable and it just sounds right. If we've entered all the notation, we'll pretend we have the whole hymn in here, we're going to want to make the last note of the verse a whole note. And most of the time in hymns it'll be that way anyway, but we'll just do it. If you want to change the value of a note, you just select it and hit the appropriate number for the value of the note. In this case 1 for whole note, or click the whole note up on top. You can see the notation. Okay, now that we've done that, we want to make sure that we have a space between each of our verses. So we're going to put a quarter rest. You place a rest by hitting a space bar instead of enter down at the end of each line. So now we have our music, we end the verse in a whole note, and we have a space at the end. Now you're wondering, where do all the other verses come from? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at next. We're going to actually copy every single one of these lines to make a second verse. But you don't have to do that all the time. We'll show you why. So first on, we'll select the top one. You do not need to reselect things like the tempo or the tenuto performance styling. So we select copy, go to the end of the line, and paste. And you notice there it is again. Same thing here. Select, copy, end of line, paste, select, copy, paste, select, copy, paste. It's also helpful to put a measure marker in between your verses so you know where it starts. You hit tab to place a measure marker, by the way, or a measure bar. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to make this so we don't have to keep copying and pasting all of our verses, because they can be pretty long on some of them, 6, 7, 8 lines worth in the hymnal. So we will create a repeat function. What we want to do is go to the beginning of the second verse we just created, and we're going to create a break, is what this particular program calls a repeat function, B for break. And it brings up our properties here, and we can select local repeat open and OK. And you'll notice it makes a musical repeat note. Now you can choose to go to the next one, hit B, and do the same thing again, or you can select the repeat.
Do that more slowly.
Copy and paste. To create it again, start at the beginning of the verse you wish to repeat. Hit the B as in boy button. Brings up the dialog box from which you select local repeat open and OK, and there's our repeat function. It does not matter if you have a whole bunch of bars or anything right before it, as long as there's no notes thrown in there incidentally. Now, we want to go to the very end of that verse and make sure you leave that rest in there, because it's important to have a break between verses. And we'll put our cursor at the end of the verse. We're also going to create a break B, except for this time it's going to be a local repeat close. Now you notice when you select local repeat close, it says repeat count. So we want to look down here and say, okay, looks like we got in our bulletin 4 verses for this hymn today. So we're going to select our repeat count to 4. And you notice a little number 4 pops up over our repeat. Now, to ensure that they all repeat the same way, you select your repeat function, copy it, and paste it at the end of all 4 of your staffs. So now we have bracketed this one verse in a local repeat open, a local repeat close with a repeat factor of 4. We do want to test this function. You can go in and start the beginning, hit your play, and you notice it'll play your first verse. Okay, then it'll move into the repeat. Okay, Each note as it plays is highlighted in red so you can see where you're at. And then look, it went right back. Okay, so our repeat function is working properly. Now what we want to do is, just to give the congregation an understanding of when to start singing, our introductory verse that we play, which is now what's outside the brackets, we need to make that a little bit different so that they know they're not supposed to sing during this time. So what we're going to do is on staff 4, we're going to take out the musical notes that are there and replace them with rests. So it will not play the bass line or the pedal line during that introduction. So what you can do is just highlight all the musical notes on the bottom line and hit delete. And you're like, oh wait, now it's all misaligned, it's not going to play right. Don't freak out, you'll be just fine. Just select a whole note rest, a number 1 rest, and hit space bar and a measure marker until they line up. You notice the bar is it's moving that verse over closer to here. We have now a whole note to go, or whole rest to go with this whole note, and we have a quarter rest left to equalize. And now we're back to normal, except for our bottom line now just has all rests. So musically, you'll have to figure out how many beats and so forth to put in those rests there. But now you'll notice that our verses all are perfectly lined up, and we're ready to go, except for this introduction will not have the duplicate bass line. This will become important because the next step that we're going to take is actually to voice the staves. We're going to say, okay, which one is each one going to sound like? And I have a pretty standardized system that I do it, but you're welcome to play around a little bit with it once you become familiar with it. Our first staff, we'll go to up here, which is our melody line. We're going to right-click on that. It'll bring up our staff menu and select Staff Properties. And here's our Staff Properties dialog box. There are 2 tabs on here that you want to mess with. The first one is called MIDI. On this one, for staff 1, you want to set the part volume to full volume, which is 127. Stereo pan, which is left and right, set to 64, which is right in the middle. You'll notice that 127 is the maximum under, 64 is close to half of it. Transposition will be 0, and channel will be channel number 1. All these settings are notated in your training manual. And here's the one change we'll make on the instrument tab. Again, on staff 1, we're going to change this to a flute. Now, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can scroll down till you find a flute, but there's about 120 instruments. The easy way to do it is just hit the first letter of the name of the instrument. So F. We hit F. Okay, there's fretless bass. We don't want that. F again, French horn. No, we don't want that. Hey, look, there's flute. So the third F is your flute. We'll go ahead and hit OK. And now let's turn this staff into a flute. The settings for the second and the third staff are, we're going to change it to a pipe organ. Again, right-click, Staff Properties, Instrument, and scroll down. It's called actually a church organ. And on staff number 2, we want to offset it slightly to the left, so we'll change our stereo pan to 40. Make sure it's on channel 2. Each staff has to be a separate channel, and then OK. Our third staff, we're going to also set to our church organ, if you can find it. Oh, we'll just use the C because I lost my place. There's church organ. And on the MIDI tab, we want to set this stereo pan to 86, which is equally on the right-hand side, as opposed to the staff 2, which was on the left-hand side. It gives a little bit of sense of presence if you have the staff offset slightly. And look, we're on channel 3, so we're on a separate step. Now finally, on the bottom one, there's a slight modification we'll make to this. We're going to right-click on it. We're going to go to Staff Properties like normal. This instrument, which will be the pedal of the organ, we're going to set to a recorder. And the reason I chose recorder is because this one has the most presence of low bass of any instruments that I can find, but yet maintain a clean sound, so it's not like an electric guitar. So we're going to hit R for recorder. There's Rhodes piano, rock organ, reed organ. Hey, look, recorder. And to make it a deep pedal tone, we're going to use the transposition setting to -12. Now, just for you techies, -12 means -12 half steps, which equals 1 octave. And also, in this case, since the recorder is so overwhelming in volume, we're going to reduce, and this is the only staff we do this, to reduce the volume slightly down to part volume at 105, if I'm not mistaken from my notes. Yes, that's right. Okay, so staff 4, set to recorder, transposition -12, part volume 105, and there it's on a separate channel by itself of 4. Great. So we've assigned all our voices. We can take a listen to how it sounds again. So that was the introduction with no pedal. And you notice the low bass. Well, maybe you don't. I see a mic in that direction, but there's a low bass on that. And now look, our voices are all of our steps repeated. Okay. So we've voiced it. Now there's a few steps that we can take to tweak the hymn a little more. Now often in hymns we have separate phrases. For example, on the hymn we're working with, it's sing my tongue the glorious battle, sing the... Anyway, you notice there's a pause at the end of the phrase. Sing my tongue the glorious battle. It's natural to have a slight pause. And then we go on to sing the ending of the phrase. Then there's normally a natural pause. What we can do is we can put in a really small rest between phrases. Just to pretend that we had after phrases, I'm going to create some extra phrases in here on this line. We can pretend that these are the phrase that we actually done. So let's start playing in here, and you can hear what I'll mean if this were an actual hymn. So here's a note. See, it just jumps to the next note with there's no little break for a breath or anything like that. It just doesn't sound right. So what we can do is we'll put a small rest on all four staffs between phrases. Now, not all hymns will be advantageous to do this. You just have to listen to them, and if they're in the classical style of a hymn, that's when you want to put in it. Some modern hymns, it'll sound really weird if you do this. You want to put a very small break. So let's go up to like a 64th note, and we'll place a 64th rest, or I say 32nd rest, in each space. Now before you put that between all the phrases of the hymn, most hymns have about 8 or 10 phrases, let's test and see how that sounds and see if it's a proper length of pause. See? And that sounded just about right. If you have a really slow hymn, much slower than this, you may have to have a smaller rest because it would be too long for a breath sound. Or if you have a really fast hymn, you may have to upgrade it to maybe an 8th note or something to make it the appropriate length for a breath. So, if we've got our breath, we're going to put in those marks on each of our phrases to denote the phrase. Once we're completed with that phrasing there, I think that we're pretty much all the way through what we need to do to create this hymn. Now, so let's say we've made this hymn. We're going to go ahead and save this. There are two things that we have to do to save it. We're going to save it in this format, an NWC or Noteworthy Composer file, so we can bring it up later and maybe change it or add different verses if we want to mess around with it later. So first thing we'll do is we'll go File, Save As. We've established a folder on here in My Music called NWC. We'll open that folder. And the format which we name our hymns is we put the number first, in this case 122, a space, a dash, then another space, and then the hymn name. So it would be Sing My Tongue the Glorious Battle. It's important you put the whole file name because before, you remember, we search by keywords. We want to make sure that we can search and find this later so we don't have to do it again. And then on the NWC file, the first time we save it, we're not going to put how many verses. So there, we've saved it in our NWC folder. Now, in order to play it in our service, we have to save it differently as a MIDI file. So we're going to go to File, Save As. We'll go up to wherever our service is. We're in 2007. And we're going to create, in this case, since we don't have it already, a service folder for next Sunday, 2:18:07 space service. And place this file in that folder, selecting the Save As type to a Type 1 MIDI file. Now we're also going to add a little note at the end of how many verses this particular mix is. In the note, so we'll do 5 VRS. Or actually, if I'm paying attention, 4 VRS. There are 4 verses. So our final file name for the MIDI version in the service folder is 122, the hymn number, dash, space, Sing My Tongue the Glorious Battle, 4 VRS for 4 verses. So we can look quickly, identify the verses, title, number, and everything. And make sure you have it on Type 1 MIDI. Save. And now you've just created a hymn that you can play back in the service, that you can recall later and mess with, and it's all ready to go in there, and we'll move to the playback. Alright, so now that we've created a hymn from scratch, let's take the easy road and say that we already have a pre-recorded version of the hymn in our database. This is one that is from those CDs that we had recorded the pipe organ music. If we look at our search screen, we're going to go back to our first hymn we talked about, hymn 250. You'll remember that we did find it. If you go up and you point to the hymn it found, it'll bring up the properties, and you'll notice that this one is 6.91 megabytes. If there's a folder or a file it finds that's larger than a few K, you know that it's a pre-recorded music, either an MP3 or a WAV sound. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that this pre-recorded music matches the service that we're going to do, especially if perchance we are using the tune from another hymn, but it's the same tune as one we're doing. It might have a different number of verses. So the way we do that is we use our GoldWave audio editing software. You get to it by just right-click on your search results for this pre-recorded, and we're going to say Open With, and select GoldWave. I will fix that to default because it's not defaulted on here. Pause.
Okay, we're doing the last couple of minutes over again.
Okay, so we've located our pre-recorded hymn. Remember hymn 250 that we found on there? You'll notice when you hover over hymn 250, it comes with the properties. When you have properties that are larger than a few K, in this case it's 6.91 megabytes, you know it's a pre-recorded one. Now what we want to do is make sure that this pre-recorded hymn matches the hymn that we're going to have for our service, especially if it's one that we picked up using the same tune but not the same hymn name. So we're going to open this to edit it with our GoldWave editing program. So we just go ahead and double click on that one, and it comes up in GoldWave. You notice that we now display the waveform for this hymn. In order to be most effective in editing it, we need to have it as big as possible. So we're going to maximize both the editing window, and then we're going to have to maximize the waveform. You can take this little control and kind of scoot it out of the way. It is important to have that on the screen though. So now here's the waveform for this hymn. Now, a lot of times you can look at the waveform and determine how many verses there are in the hymn right away, because, as we did when we made our own hymns, there's a little break between each verse. Now, if you're not sure where that break is, you're going to want to listen to the hymn ahead of time and just listen and make a mental note of where it is. When you play in this software, which is on this control panel, here's the play button, you'll notice there's a cursor that moves along wherever in the waveform that you are. Now also on these pre-recorded hymns, you'll notice there's an introduction. The introduction may be a full verse, or it may be just a partial verse, or sometimes it's just an ad-lib that the organist did that's kind of like the hymn. So you want to make sure that you don't consider the introduction part of the number of verses. So we're still listening to introduction here, and you notice our cursor moving along. I bet you when it gets to this break, it's going to start a new verse. We'll see if that happens. See? Now you start, that's actually where the congregation would start singing. So now in this case, we want to take a look at that, and it's going to play all the way through here, and we're going to see if we get to an end of another verse. Now, make a mental note, we got the break here, and we're going to get through the rest of this particular verse, and note where the end of it is. It's also helpful as you're doing this to make sure that you have your hymnal open to that hymn so you can follow through and know when you get to the beginning and get to the end of a verse. Also, we want to make sure that this happens to coincide with the same tune that everybody's going to be looking at if they happen to use their hymnal. Now here, look, we're coming up to the end of a verse. And look, see the little break? That's where the end of the verse is. Okay, so we're going to stop our playback here. And we notice, okay, this chunk right here is a verse. Now, verses on traditional hymns are always going to be the same length. So we got a chunk here, we got a chunk here, and we got a chunk here, excluding the introduction. So we have 1, 2, 3 verses that are on this hymn. Now let's take a look. Uh-oh, this particular hymn only has 2 verses. So we need to fix that problem. What we want to do is we want to isolate a single verse and delete it. So what we do is we take our cursor and we click near or as close as we can to the beginning of a verse.
Whoa,
and you notice
where's your cursor when you're doing that? I can't see it.
Right here.
Okay.
At the break in a verse, I usually pick not the first and not the last verse to delete, okay, because those tend to be the more triumphant verses. And if we're reducing the number of verses, we're going to want to leave the most triumphant verses in there. So I left clicked at the beginning of a verse, or close to it. You have to be perfect, we can fix it in a minute. And we're going to go down to the end of that same verse
and right-click at the end of the verse. It pops up a menu, and you select Set Finish Marker. And now what we can do is we want to fine-tune where we selected to make sure that we're at the very beginning and the very end of that particular verse so we do an accurate edit. The way you do that is you zoom in. There's a zoom in function up at the top on the toolbar. If you click it, you notice the waveform gets bigger. So we zoomed in about 5 or 6 clicks, and you can notice that the waveform trails off substantially and is almost nothing for a short waves. We want to make sure that we get that click right in there. We're actually pretty good. We're right at the a little bit after the end of where it trails off. So the beginning is good. We want to make sure our end is good too. We can stay zoomed in and go down and use the standard scroller and scroll to the end of the selection. You'll notice at the bottom of the screen that it summarizes the entire waveform through the length of the screen, and the highlighted portion is visible as a whole. So we can take that scroller and park it right at the end of what we selected. So here's our selection right here. You notice I made kind of a mistake. I didn't click all the way at the end of that sound because I couldn't see it. I wasn't zoomed in. So we can modify the end. Again, we're going to move to where it should be, right here where the sound trails off. We're going to right-click again and set our finish marker there. And now it moves that finish marker over. So now we have an accurate selection for the first and part and the accurate selection for the end of this verse. We can just simply hit delete, poof, and that verse is gone. You can zoom back out again using the zoom out on the top, and you'll notice that lo and behold, we now have our introduction, we have our verse 1, and we have our verse 2, and that's it. Now we always want to check and make sure we didn't screw up the sound when we did this. So the best way to do that is just go and click somewhere near the end of the verse where you just made the edit and make sure that your highlighted point goes beyond what you want to listen to. So I just clicked here for a start selection, clicked somewhere near the end. And this is where the break is, where we deleted the verse. Let's listen to that and make sure it sounds okay. See, there we go. We had a good pause. You didn't have a pop or a fizz or any fragment of sound between those verses. Now you can also just go ahead and review the entire hymn again. If you want to listen to the whole thing or highlight the whole thing, just like you would in a Word document, you hit Control-A and it selects the entire waveform. Now, let's say, for example, that we had a hymn like this, and it comes up and it says, oh, well, we have 2 verses here, but we really need 4 verses. Okay? We do kind of the same process. We want to accurately select the beginning by left-clicking of a verse. We want to accurately select the end by right-clicking and set finish of a verse. We will zoom in and check our beginning, which is now right in a nice dead spot. We can scroll over and take a look at our end, which was a little bit off, so we're going to right-click, finish marker there. Now we've accurately selected a verse. We can copy and paste a copy of this verse, just like you would in your Word document. Control-C to copy, and you hit Control-V. In this case, I want to add 2 verses, so I hit Control-V again. Now we can go ahead and zoom back out. And you'll notice that we have a bunch more verses. We now have the introduction. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, and I must accidentally hit Control-V a few extra times. So we have 5 verses in here. And again, what we want to do is we'll select the whole hymn and take a listen to it to make sure that it's okay. So what we've gone through is we've eliminated a verse from a pre-recording. We've copied and made extra verses on the recording. So now we have the right number of verses for this particular one. Now, just as a hint, let's pretend that, say you have a hymn that starts with, we'll say, 4 verses, but you need 8 verses. You don't want to always just copy the same verse over and over again on a pre-recording, because people notice, oh man, it sounds exactly the same again. Because for pre-recordings, it's much more evident than if you were playing it back with the MIDI software like we created before. So what you can do, let's say you have 4 verses and you want to make 8. Say, pick verse 2, copy that and paste it once, then maybe select verse 3, copy, paste that once, then maybe select verse 2 and 3 together, copy and paste that, and boom, you got 8 verses, and there's a little bit of variety to your playback. So, now we've created our hymn, and we're ready to save this. When we want to save an edited, pre-recorded hymn, we want to save it as a WAV file, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to go to File and Save As.
Slow.
Then we'll go and we're going to save it in our service folder. Since we don't have a music notation, we're only going to save it once as the final version. The previous version that we edited from is already stored in the system we can come back to later. So let's go to our My Music, 2007 Services, go to the service we're working on, in this case the 18th, and we want to change the settings at the bottom. Save as type needs to be wave, which is the first thing at the top of the list. And then we'll use the same naming convention that we discussed earlier. We have the number for the hymn, a space, a dash, a space, the full title of the hymn, and at the end, how many verses. And I made this one 5 verses. So 5 VRS and save. It'll take a few seconds to save that because it's a rather large file compared to a MIDI file. And there, you've just created a pre-recorded, edited hymn version for playback during the service.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, everybody. Now, it's Sunday morning, which is why all the lights are turned off in the church and nobody else is here. Oh, wait. We'll pretend it's Sunday morning, and we're going to set up and play a service today. So what we're going to do is we're going to be using our Yamaha XG synthesizer program. You access that program, as you recall, by double-clicking in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Right there, this little thing says XG Soft, and this little box pops up here. Now, what you want to do before you start playing anything is prepare your service so it's all in order and ready to go. You'll recall that we saved our service into a service folder with all the files that we need. So what we do is on the XG Synth, we go to the playlist, and it brings up our playlist setting dialog box. Now, there's several playlists I've already set up that are with the right songs for different circumstances. For example, I have Communion Loop, which is the songs that we play while the distribution is occurring. We have Morning Praise, which is the liturgy we use every so often. We have our Communion Liturgy for Communion Sundays. We have a few selected songs for the offering, as well as for preludes and for postludes. So what we're going to focus on now is the last thing, hymns. In the hymns playlist, I always leave the liturgy triple amen at the end, which is the amen, amen, amen after the benediction. Because we almost invariably use it, and even when pastor doesn't put it in there, with the exception of the morning praise service, I play it anyway. So, we have our triple amen, don't delete it. Now, maybe if you did last Sunday already, you'll have some other songs in there, just delete all of them. Highlight everything except for the triple amen and click delete. But we're going to load today's service. So we'll click add songs to playlist with the media file button. So we navigate to where we store our hymns, which will be in My Music, 2007 services. And let's pull up last Sunday's service from the 11th. Now, this one was kind of complicated because we had all kinds of liturgy and some hymns and new stuff and everything like that. But here we have all our files, and we can, since if we set up all of them properly before by saving them in this folder, we'd add all right here in the dialog. And notice they all pop up in the playlist. We can close our folder. And now we need to arrange them to the order of the bulletin. We want to have our bulletin ready to go here, and we can rearrange these. It's real simple to do. Well, let's say that this 225 was the first hymn. We select it, move to the top. Just move everything around until it's in the right order. Go page by page, line through the bulletin, and make sure you've ordered this all correctly. So like the triple amen is going to be down near the end. The chimes are going to be at the bottom. Please reference the manual for how to create chimes. And we'll get this all organized. So once it's all organized in the order of the service in this playlist, select the first thing in the playlist, which should be your first hymn, and hit OK. And it'll default to that first hymn is already displayed. Now you'll notice that we lost a little bit of this box here. It'll show the program differently when you have pre-recorded and when you have hymns that we have created in the music notation program. When you lose all those sliders down here, that means this is a pre-recorded hymn that we added or subtracted verses on and we're ready to play. If we went to another hymn or a piece of the liturgy that was something we made in the sheet music program, you'll notice all this stuff comes into play here. So we can actually on the fly make adjustments to different voices and so forth. More on this in a minute. So now we've set up our hymns for the day. We're ready to play our pre-service. It's real simple. Just go to the playlist folder, select our preludes, pick something. By the way, when you pick something and play, it'll just keep on playing more afterward. Hit OK. And you can start playback after you make a few more settings. Anytime we play any music on this, we want to select the stage or reverb setting. It just makes it sound better. And this little slider here, which is controlled by our less and more effect buttons, we want to put it down to about 2 bars. That'll give us the optimal effect for playback. It gives a little reverb, a little echo to give more presence to our hymns. So we've selected our stage or reverb setting. We put it down to 2 bars. and we can go ahead and click play. Over on the left-hand side here are sliders that affect the playback. We adjust to an appropriate volume. For pre-service, of course, it's kind of quiet. So we want to listen to it so we don't disturb the people who are, socializing together down in the bottom, or praying or whatever before the service. So we'll go ahead and play our prelude on here. When the pastor comes up to the front and gets ready, he usually does a little preparation around the altar, gets his Bible and his bulletin organized and everything, and we're going to want to keep an eye on him. When he sits down behind the lectern, we know that he's pretty much ready to go, and he'll usually look up and make a gesture in your direction or whatnot when he's ready to go. Also, you want to take a look just over the rail and see how people are getting situated, make sure most people are getting sat down, and we're ready to go. When so, you make a gesture to the pastor. We're going to turn pastor's mic up, and we're going to fade our prelude. Okay? So pastor, while he's talking and getting this and welcoming everybody to the service and everything, we need to get back over here, stop, and switch playlist to our hymns that we already arranged. So we have the playlist button and go to our hymns. And lo and behold, here's our hymn list we already organized, and we're ready to go with that first one. Okay? Pastor will introduce the first hymn, and we can start singing. Oh, I almost forgot. There's one little adjustment you can make during pre-service, which is kind of important. Let's say we're playing a song. I said we're playing a song, and there's sound coming through. This setting shouldn't change that often. Uh-oh. Hit a button somewhere. We're going to adjust our volume settings. They're cut from it. Okay, now pastor's introducing the service. He's welcoming the congregation. Huh? It just doesn't like you, Jim. Just want to throw all kinds of stuff at you.
Must have been
Okay, so now that pastor is welcoming the congregation to the service and giving his introduction, we're going to switch back and make sure that we get to our hymns. So we'll go back and select our hymn playlist. We're still on the first song there, and okay. So our first hymn is ready to go. Now, at this point, while he's still talking, or a little bit before the service, you could have been taking a look at the meter up here with the volume turned all the way off. The VU meter on the left will indicate the input. We want to make sure that the meter is not throwing up into the red all the way or bouncing wildly across and back. You see it's just having a little nice bump up on the bottom, about to 5 to 7 at the top. That's about right. If you notice it's going way up or you don't see it at all, that's when it's time to adjust our volume control on our XG software. You notice if I turn it all the way down, the VU meter stops. If I turn it all the way up, the VU meter jumps up a ways. So usually about 3/4 of the way is just about right. Okay, now pastor has introduced the service, and we're ready to go to our first hymn. When we're playing a hymn, we want to push the volume up slightly before we click play over on the XG player. So I push it up, and then we can get a little gauge of how loud it's going to be, and then adjust to the right volume for the congregation. We'll go ahead and play through our hymn, and when we get to the end of a pre-recorded hymn, it's a little bit different on a MIDI hymn. A pre-recorded hymn, you'll notice the organ stops or whatever voice it is. We want to kill the volume first, and then stop over here. Okay? Now, you just follow along, start playing and stopping and playing and stopping for that. On a MIDI hymn, let's take a look at one of those. It's a little bit different. That's one of the ones where we have all the controls on the screen here. Now, when we're playing a MIDI hymn, there's a little bit of preparation that we want to do beforehand. We want to, again, select our reverb or stage setting. Make sure that the effect is down to 2 bars. Okay? And then when we start to play it back after pastor's introduced the hymn or said the liturgy where that part is, again we'll turn our volume up slightly. We'll hit play over here, play whatever it is. You can adjust on the fly. Okay, maybe it's too loud, maybe it's too soft. Maybe. And during the introduction to the hymn, you want to take another listen to the tempo that you set earlier. I'm saying, oh, this is a little too fast. I'm going to slow it down. You have a tempo indicator right here. You only have that on MIDI hymns. You do not have that on wave hymns. So here comes our hymn. You'll notice the bass kicked in after our introductory verse. if you're saying, oh, well, you know, this is a little heavy on the clarinet sound, you can adjust that, or it would usually be a flute sound for the main line. This particular hymn was mixed with several different instruments. Let's take a look at another hymn that we have in a regular traditional organ format. You notice there's the recorder on the last line, and it's down a little bit, just like we set it when we originally created the hymn. You can say, okay, well, that's a little too much on that bass sound, and adjust it. But the other sounds pretty good, and we want to make sure that we have our reverb on. If there's a quick exchange on the liturgy, like for example during the communion, when pastor says, you know, it says something, then we play something, it says something, play something, you don't really have to worry about that reverb switch. It's just for, you know, a really good effect. But during a hymn, it's nice to have that, that sound. So now, let's say that we've come to the end of a hymn. We're playing along, we have our full volume. At the very last verse, we'll pretend this verse is the last verse. We'll have maybe one click on the last couple phrases, click down the tempo slightly.
Where do you do that?
On the tempo slider right there, the hymn ends, you kill the volume first, then you kill the actual playback. So the last couple phrases, you'll notice on the thing looks like a metronome. The last couple phrases on the last line of the last verse of the hymn, slow it down a little bit and just, you know, gives a nice ending effect to that hymn. Don't worry, when you go to the next hymn, it'll automatically reset the settings on there. So you won't start out super slow on that hymn unless you happen to sing the same hymn again. So, there's a lot of other features on the playback on the Yamaha XG that we can talk about, but those are the basics. I just want to make sure that you have your hymns loaded in order in the playlist like we discussed. Before we play a hymn, you want to try to hit that reverb key and make sure that the effect line is at 2 bars. And then as you're playing, you could adjust the sliders if you wish for individual voices once you get familiar with it. And then at the end of each time you play something, stop volume first after the last note, and then stop here. That way you won't accidentally, you know, jump to the next hymn and start playing that since you've killed the volume. Now the one thing you'll notice is that I've left Pastor's microphone up the whole way. That's okay to do because Pastor will actually turn on and turn off his mic using a mute switch on his little wireless pack. You can choose to, if you wish, drop him down when he's not talking like during a hymn, but he's pretty good about muting it. If you notice that suddenly Pastor is singing really, really loud, well, that means he forgot to mute it. So you can go ahead and pop that down if you wish. But especially when there is no hymns in sight, like during the sermon, during the lessons, you want to just make sure that your sliders are nice and down. Every so often you might accidentally bump a slider, and that can cause background noise and stuff that might be distracting to the service. And of course, on the red ones, you'll remember the first thing we said, keep them all the way up. So that's Larry's dissertation on how to do music for the service. The last thing I'll just throw in there is at the end of the service, we're going to play a postlude. My particular favorite ones, there's a couple of these ones by this organ composer, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but his name's Buxtehude. But anyway, we can play that. That's our postlude to this presentation. And good luck playing some music during the service.
And Larry has informed us that he will be standing by every Sunday from now until we meet in heaven for a telephone call asking him, what the heck did you say? Isn't that correct, Larry?
You're the funniest guy out there.